Warning, this podcast may contain bad language and content that some listeners may find informative.
I mean, he didn't say scenes, which is fantastic.
Yeah, I'm getting there. It may contain squirrels falling from trees and dying.
I mean, there's no squirrels referenced at all in the episode. But I see what you did.
There's loads of squirrels referenced.
But what happened to those squirrels?
They're falling. We've been through this, man.
Yeah, I feel sad.
I feel like we're not doing great intros recently.
I feel like you're not bringing the thunder, personally. I think that you're the one who brings all the effort to the intros, and I just sit here getting ridiculed.
Oh, so your problem is that I'm not taking the piss out of you enough?
Pretty much.
Right. Well, you're a... Welcome to the Seesaw Podcast with T and Cleves.
Each week, offering up a delayed perspective on life. Welcome to a brand new, shiny episode right off the forecourt. Willkommen, German again. How ist Cleves?
I'm fine. If anything, you should have done the welcoming Canadian.
Hello, eh?
Oh my god.
That's why I didn't do it. It's terrible.
We should just literally get straight into it. This week is going to be about the Falling Squirrel game, The Vale. Do you want to give a quick overview of the game?
The Vale, Shadow of the Crown.
Is this The Last of Us Part 2 where you fucked me on that shit? It's Last of Us Part 2.
You'll be right. So, The Vale, Shadow of the Crown is a game from Falling Squirrel. This game is a visual... How do you define it? It's sort of like a visual novel? No,
not at all. I would describe it as an audio-based
game.
There is like very minimal visuals. Yeah,
That no visuals. I got mixed up, and no doubt you're going to keep this in to be a dick.
Oh, no doubt.
This is a game that's been released which has no visual content really. I mean, it does have a little bit, but negligible to the point where it does not have anything to do with like the gameplay.
It's all based on sound. You listen to it through your headphones, you listen through the ears. It's a fantasy-based game. It's about a princess that's trying to find the way home. It's pretty much all explained in what we're about to talk about, and we're here to chat with the developers of that game.
Awesome. So if you guys want to sort of introduce yourselves, like and who you are, what you do.
Yeah, sure. I guess I'll start. My name's Dave Evans. I am the owner and I guess I could say founder of Falling Squirrel. It's funny when you have a company that's really one or two people. I could say, CEO, CFO, all sorts of fun stuff. And Falling Squirrel is a video game developer, and we just recently made a game, our first in-studio project, which is a audio-based adventure game, which is accessible for the blind and low vision community.
And I'm Jamie Roboz, and I was the producer on this project.
Fantastic. So, of course, the game you're talking about, the Vale, Shadow of the Crown, available now at all good retailers.
Yeah.
I played it on the Xbox Series S, I think the one I've got. I think it's on PC as well, isn't it?
Yes. Yep.
I've completed it, and Eric's played a huge chunk of it in secret. I set him up on it once and then said, there you go, play this. And then we've been chatting, sort of like getting our notes together before like this chat. And he's gone, oh, yeah, I've done this, and this.
I know, but I can't play it with you because you backseat game.
I am bad for that, to be fair.
Even with headphones on, he still somehow manages to get in the back seat there.
Yeah.
You see, this is embarrassing, but I put a headphone splitter on. So I could get it as well. So I suppose my first question is, where did the concept come from? Because obviously it's quite unique. Where did the idea come from?
Gosh, 5 years ago now, I wanted to start kind of a pet project that I could play with things I was particularly okay at, like narrative and voice direction, that sort of thing. And I just wanted a simple project that I could make a fairly big world and game experience with not a lot of money. That's really how it started. And within a few months of sort of figuring out what this game would be and figuring out that even though it's a bit of a trope, I wanted to have a blind protagonist as the main character in this audio only experience. I realized, oh, this is obviously accessible for the blind community. And I wandered into the CNIB, which is the Canadian National Institute for the Blind. And lo and behold, there were a lot of people there interested in video games and this project in particular. So that's kind of where it all started.
Yeah, once we started doing the market analysis to get some funding for the project, we realized that, there are a lot of similar games like this, and there's a pretty large online community that's really passionate about other audio-based games. So it was really neat to kind of see it incidentally come together as an advocacy project. I guess we didn't initially intend for it to be that way, but we're really happy with the direction that it quickly started to take.
So was it that you wanted to make a sort of audio only based game and then the story came afterwards, or did you have the story in place going in and then it just kind of felt better that it was audio only?
Much of the story was there from the beginning, mainly because I felt, and I have to state this so anyone listening within the blind community, there is a bit of a trope for sighted developers in particular, but anyone making a game who's doing it in all audio and thinking of trying to align the experience of the player with the fact that you can't see anything, that they immediately make the main character blind, which isn't necessarily the experience that blind gamers are looking for. But I really did start this as the novelty of playing a blind character as a sighted person is really where that started. And so the story about this princess who's sort of lost in the Barrens and has to make her way home with her own sort of cunning and ability, and then the help of others, was really the beginning of the idea. So yeah, the story kind of came first, actually.
Did you write the story yourself, or how has that sort of come together?
Yeah, I largely did. I do, as a writer, I do workshop material with other writers. There's, I don't think I've done a proper project unless the best idea in the game, narrative wise, doesn't come from somebody who's not me. It just always seems to happen. So I do have to give quite a bit of credit to my wife who wrote sections of the game, and some of my interns that were interested in narrative came up with some great ideas, but mostly me forming it. But I always get help, and the blind community that helped me sort of hone in on the right experience and sort of steered me away from some stuff that may not have been as good. I don't know how else to put it. Yeah, I didn't run into too many pitfalls, but they were there to help me through that.
Were they quite involved then in the sort of designing of it?
In the end, in particular, yes. There was a period at the very beginning where we did a lot of focus testing and we got a lot of feedback, and that was there's sort of a phase one that sort of aligned everything. I kind of was aware of the pitfalls. I knew that the character couldn't be defined by their disability. They had to have their own arc and trajectory, and they had to be defined by something completely outside of the experience of being blind. These were things that I kind of knew going in, but that sort of solidified once I connected with the community. And then in particular at the end, during rounds of focus testing, a huge amount of community feedback came in at a time where we could still make adjustments. And in particular, there was one game developer from Prague, from the blind community, Lukas Hansel, and he was instrumental in kind of helping me at the end, just with the UI, just everything, just little narrative tweaks and things like that. But pretty much a cast of about 100 people from the blind and low vision community were there playing multiple versions of the game.
Oh, yeah, at least. And I don't know what Lucas's work situation is, but if anybody listening to the podcast needs a good game developer who's really got that perspective with regards to accessibility in the blind and low vision community, that is probably the guy that you want to get in touch with. Also, yeah, a big shout out to audiogames.net for being a community that we continue to go to time and time again to give us feedback or help in testing for anything. The people there are just so ready to get involved and have a discussion and aren't afraid about giving you their opinion, whether they love it or whether there are things that they really hate. And particularly being an indie developer, having that level of engagement without, I don't want to say without having to work for it, but just kind of having it there and having everybody engage with you off the bat because of the project that you're making is so valuable. And I will continue to say until the end of time that like I cannot thank that community enough for their passionate involvement.
It's so refreshing to hear that like you've gone out and you've reached out to these communities and they've given you feedback. I'm just curious, is there anything that was flagged to you as a no, don't do that, that's a trope, like that's something that we wouldn't want to see? Like, is there anything that sort of stands out?
Yeah, obviously the one I mentioned, which was the whole center of the experience of this character, was something that I think as a writer, I would always want a character to be defined by multiple things, but I really was very cognizant of getting that right. That in fact, it was something I went on my way to. Most people within blind or sighted community will forget about the main character's blindness within about 15, 20 minutes of playing the game. You get the setup, you understand what you're doing, and now you close your eyes and play an experience. I don't know if, by the way, that was your experience, but that's the intention of a lot of this. And then those moments where you do remind people about that, those were the intersections where I got a lot of comments. I'm trying to think of maybe one of the better ones was I'd made a joke about the character, your companion character says, why don't you have a look around this village? And then he corrects himself and says, have a listen around, right? It was funny because there was two sides mounting saying, oh, this is totally something somebody who would not understand the community would say. So that was the perspective of this character saying that. Then it was like, is this something we want to remind people about? Or would we, we would never say, listen, there was certain phrasings of, I mean, the obvious one is that, people within the blind community say, see you later, or I'll see you next time. They say see, and it's part of our vernacular, right? And they don't skirt around it and say, I'll hear you later, right? So yeah. There was a bristling to that. And I'm like, I just removed it because I'm like, it's an interesting debate that yes, this character would have that. But because I'm not actually making a 10th century backdrop, like period piece, it's like, this is a fantasy world that doesn't have a lot of patriarchy in it. Like there's other things that I've kind of pulled away. The character as a female main character doesn't get questioned. But so I'm like, well, yeah, maybe I don't need to go into that. There's some characters, enemies in particular, that don't have a lot of respect for her blindness, but it's just these little moments.
I think one of the ones that stands out for me is Alex asking for things to be described to her. I remember that had a pretty, I guess, heated back and forth on forums about whether people felt it was appropriate or not. And I think what's important is that we just like try to listen to a lot of it. And also Dave mentioned finding the right verbiage as to, people say see colloquially, and that is okay. That is also a thing that, and I will speak for myself and not for both of us, because maybe Dave already was super tactful. But that is a thing that I was worried about initially, and the whole process of testing and working with the CNIB and the blind low vision community. That was a learning process of learning what was or wasn't okay and how that all goes.
And ultimately making friends in the community. I did not have friends in the community, and now I do. So that was half of what I got out of this whole project.
Yeah, and we can loop back around to it, but on the question was, was the community really involved more so than just testing or chiming in online with their opinions? Yeah, we have Lucas, a developer. We have voice actors from the blind low vision community that were involved in the project. We have consultant Martin Corsellis, who consulted in a lot of the prototyping and early work for the game. So we tried to, check our privilege enough by involving people in the community and listening to them over us whenever we could, I feel.
I'm going to throw like my assumption out there, but I assume that both of you are not a member of that community, just from like the way you've explained things.
Yeah, we're both cited, yes.
Sort of on that, I mean, the question was going to be the same regardless. But how difficult was it to design a game sort of with no sort of visual aspect to it at all? Like, was that quite tough to do? Yeah,
there was aspects of it that were surprisingly easy, and I thought might be, I suspected, in that this game's built in a 3D engine, and just in getting the general metrics right of this is how tall a person is, this is where their ears are placed, this is where the sound of feet happen, this is where the sword swings, this is where people talk from, and this is the size of a city square. I literally just laid stuff out in 3D space with these little rudimentary like boxes and stuff, and blocked it out like I would a game that would have visuals, and then listened to it and said, oh, that sounds about right. And there's quite a bit of tweaking. And then from a playability standpoint, then we started learning little things that we'd need to adjust that would probably have some visual analog in a visual game. For example, if there's a really important beacon in, like, say, a city square, it would be probably likely isolated by a shaft of light, or there'd be some lighting cue, or it'd be this big obvious object that's the town hall or something, and it's a landmark. Well, we had to do that with audio. We would landmark certain sounds. We had to come up with reasonable sounds for everything you'd have to find. There's a lot of sellers that you can interact with. There's a tavern that always has music. There's a blacksmith that's always banging away. There's a monastery, and then he used the monastery bells to be a beacon. And these were elevated slightly above the din of the atmospheric crowd. And then we also placed sort of hidden secret things that kind of rewarded players for listening carefully. Things that were a bit in the background, which were not related to main quests and wouldn't result in frustration not being able to find, but they would be kind of surprises that you would find in the game. And that's really what it came down to, is just laying this stuff out, listening to it. There was quite a bit we learned in how to handle combat. Like, a good example would be just handling like the precision of attacks. I at one point thought we could have a player surrounded by enemies at various degrees of 360. And then I realized, depending on how well your head's adjusted to our specific version of binaural audio, which I guess there's a head transfer effect that changes based on your head size and ears and stuff, is that we couldn't rely. It would sound great to everybody, but the precision through which you could hear someone is 45 degrees to your right was not there. So we had to make sure people were basically to the right, the left, and in front of you, and sort of held to these slots in order to make combat fluid and playable for everybody. And there's 20 other things, I'm sure.
I mean, to interject with one or two of the 20, I think what was really interesting is, we wanted to try to get as many people using a controller to play our game as possible. We felt it was the best experience. It had force feedback as well. And a lot of people who haven't played games before, because the medium's generally visually inaccessible, are unfamiliar with the controller. So somebody's holding a controller for the first time, they can feel where the sticks are, which is what you use to aim your attacks. But what they feel is all the way to the left might be a little bit left and up. And that's, when we realized we weren't able to accommodate really, really high degrees of accuracy and had to widen out those attack zones. So those were the kinds of challenges that we didn't expect to have just because it wasn't at the front of our minds. So those were interesting things to come across. And Dave earlier mentioned head-related transfer function. HRTF is the biological function of how your brain pinpoints the direction of a sound that you hear. And when working with binaural audio, and I think this is still probably the case for some people in the final release of the game, that if you have a character in the game that's moving from your left in front of you to your right, for some people, just based on the way that their HRTF works in relation to the game audio, they will hear that as somebody moving behind them. And there are some adjustments that can be done, and I think we did a pretty good job by the end of development to make that work for as many people as possible. But stuff like that is the kind of things that I don't think we could have predicted necessarily. We just kind of had to run into that and realize, oh, yeah, this is an issue. Let's do our best.
Yeah, and trying to demo a game without any visuals, we realized we needed headphone splitters because someone would get stuck and I'd be like, I don't know where you are. I can't see. So we would have alternate versions that we could see the 3D, what's happening in 3D. So I could at least know what was going on early on. And then eventually, once we had built to the game without that 3D element, we kind of hid from the player. We'd have to put headphones on and listen to them play to know what's going on.
Cool. That's literally answered pretty much my next question, which was what was the constraints of making a game like that? So I guess following on from that, how did you sort of balance the difficulty levels?
When we were looking at, the community that we primarily wanted to market the game towards, there were a few subsets of players. There were people who had never played a game before. There were people who had only played audio games before, and, they liked audio games to varying degrees. And then there were people who would just really... I'm trying to think of the right idiom for working really hard, but it's failing me. But they would just work real hard at playing any game that they were really particular about, whether it was accessible or not. My favorite example of this is from Mortal Kombat. The sound design in it is really, really well done, to the point where there are a number of blind and low vision players who even play it competitively. And so people who were in that last subset of players wanted a really hard game. They played every audio game that existed. They were all too easy. They were pretty adept at video games as it is, because they have to challenge themselves more than a sighted player to just access a game, and they wanted something really hard. But we also wanted the game to be just as playable for people who had never touched a game before. So the Vale has varying difficulty levels that affect how I guess merciful combat is and how many mistakes you can make. We worked really hard to find a good balance where if you're on easy, you're going to be able to get through the game no matter what. And if you're on hard, hopefully, fingers crossed, and I'm sure if you're listening to this and you disagree, you can definitely let us know and we'll do our best to fix it for the next game. But fingers crossed, it satisfied that itch for I guess the more masochistic gamers, which I am. So I definitely remember moments in testing where I was rage quitting just from testing, and I think that's where I'm like, this might be the right place to tune it.
I did that last night when fighting the baker. It was pissing me off and I had to get to bed.
I think that one was harder before release too, eh? Is that right, Dave?
I think so. It was actually broken. Yeah, it wasn't possible to finish at one point. It was literally. It's like, why are you shooting so many fireballs at me? Like it was brutal. But yeah,
that's what I was screaming at the screen.
Yeah, I think that's where we wanted the hard difficulty to land. So thank you. I'm sure. I hope it was the best worst experience you could get for difficulty.
Sometimes, where you have got a lot of these accessible games out there, they are just far too easy. It's like you get through it and you think that's too easy. Where's the challenge? And it was great to have like that genuine challenge.
On the screen you get like the sort of lights. When you move, there is like very minimal visuals, isn't there? How did you decide on those?
Basically, they're a crutch for sighted players. We originally had a control scheme for movement, which was not aligned to standard first-person shooter controls. So it was at one point even more important that I felt we put these particles in, because people that were expecting or had certain expectations as to how controls would work, especially within the sighted community who are playing a lot of first-person games, I thought it would be helpful to have that in there. It arguably became a slightly less important as we ended up aligning our control system a little bit more with that. But there was still an aspect of not having on the keyboard, you don't have the standard mouse WASD keys. You're using, arrow keys and things. And just to know that it's strafing, it's a lot easier than saying, right and left is strafing, that kind of thing. And to be quite honest, the blind community just listened more carefully. They would be so reliant in day-to-day life at listening carefully that they just seem to pick it up so much faster. So it stayed in there as a crutch for sighted players. And with the idea that once you understand how the game generally works, you really should close your eyes and play it that way. And then the other thing was, at one point I was told there was there's a technical requirement to make sure that there's always visuals on the screen so that people know the game didn't freeze. And I don't even know how true that is, to be honest, but it's been in there forever. And then we just did a couple things with it, changed the color and movement a little bit for flavor, but with the idea that we would never do anything that would make the game easier to play once you understand it. Mainly so that people didn't feel like there was something being withheld from the sighted or the blind community in terms of getting extra information that was important. So that's the reason it's there.
There's also a map that comes up when you're traveling. And I know that we had discussed ideas for some other things for a lot of people who have vision issues, they still can see some things or like some light. It's not just a black screen. So we had discussed having like textures if you find certain equipment or gear from enemies, and ultimately that stuff didn't make it in, but there were other minor visual, I guess, like cosmetic concessions that we had thought about.
I mean, I closed my eyes when I was playing. My wife would always walk through and she'd go, "Are you playing anything? Like, why's the screensaver on?" It's like,
yeah.
It's like, it's not a screensaver, it's a game. But of course, sort of like where the game really shines is, I think, is the audio design. How did you design, like, what sort of ideas went into the audio design? Because there were some parts where it was genuinely creepy without the visual aspect.
The noise for the rift is just haunting.
Oh, good. I sort of take probably more credit than I should when I talk. I say, when I talk about creative stuff, I say there was a sound designer as well, Tom Mullen, who wasn't working in engine. He's a film and TV person, but he basically provided most of the hero sounds. So as soon as there was something, I got a really good pack of high quality medieval combat sounds. So that was just me putting things together carefully, and then some environmental packs that would have that. So that was the basis. And then anything that was important enough to be sort of a game defining element, like the rifts and the relic sounds and things like that, I threw it over the wall to Tom to design. So there was a professional sound designer creating the basic important pieces of the game, and he was also the person recording the audio for the voiceover as well. So obviously there's quite a bit of audio. So those to me were the most important things. I would say without a doubt, performance was the most important thing to me in a narrative game like this. And even in combat, something as simple as combat, as important as the impacts and things are, just feeling like characters you're not fighting somebody on some sort of audio loop or something, was relatively important. You might hear the odd repeated sound, but in general, it should feel relatively unique each fight on some level, through having enough variety in taunts and things like that. And so that was, to me, the real focus of the design. And everything else was really just leaning on the binaural audio tool, is figuring out what this thing could do, what it couldn't do. I had some real high hopes for having more feeling of height when large objects would rise up, which isn't hugely important for play, thank goodness, but it never really came through with the limitations in the plugin we were using in the software. So, we just really kind of leaned on that, and then made sure people could hear stuff, and really approached each scene as its own contained emotion, is sort of the thing I come back to. So there would be scenes that were meant to be creepy, and hopefully we delivered on that. And there were scenes that were meant to be funny. And there were scenes that were meant to be just adrenaline pumping sort of things. And all the focus was make sure everything lines up with those general emotions you're supposed to have in those things, which I think is important for a game that's supposed to feel, at least aspire to feel AAA epic in scale on some level, is to have it not be a monotone, like a journey that's just kind of consistent, like an arena fighter or something would have that very consistent feel. This was meant to change moment to moment. And there's a run-on thought. But the other thing that was relatively important was taking the basics of our combat and figuring out ways we could reinvent the scenario in a meaningful or interesting way without rewriting our entire combat engine. So it's like, oh, where can you fight? Well, you could fight on horseback, and mechanically it'd be very similar, but we can make it feel like you're actually riding a horse, or you'd fight on a floating raft and pirates are jumping on your ship and attacking you. Those are the things we kind of went out of our way to see if we could create these scenarios in audio incredibly cheaply compared to what you'd have to do in can you imagine in a full visual game, if somebody said, hey, can we add a pirate scene? And you'd be like, oh my God, water technology. And is it going to be rocking on physics? Like, there'd be all these questions that come up, and all that goes away. It's like, I found the right sounds, and really trying to exploit the intimacy of combat was probably the key to a lot of what we did in audio design, realizing that things that are far away from you have less meaning. They kind of get lost in the background. But when things get up close, combat's close, even something as simple as an interaction with an NPC, you don't have too many NPCs walk up and whisper in your ear in most games. And we just sort of exploited those things that the binaural audio did really nicely.
And we're back from the interview, and I think that was really interesting, Cleves, like finding out like the development process of a game, especially one with no visual content. I mean,
it's a brand new, well, it's not brand new, but it's taking it to mass market like they have is insane.
Yeah, I mean, there have been games out there that do not have any sort of visual content to them.
Yeah, but they're for full-on blinkies. They're not for everyone.
That's true, and this game, like the Vale, is available on PC and Xbox, like Xbox One, and then the new iteration, Xbox Series S and X. So it's like, this has gone mainstream, which I've never heard of any of these other sort of like blind focused games being on these platforms. I think that's a huge step.
As they pointed out as well, and as I thought while I was playing it, it's not really a blind game. It's more of an every person's game. It just happens to be the fact that you're a blind character.
I think it was a fantastic interview. It was great to have the guys on.
And that was just part one. Next time, we are going to be talking to them about the future of games in terms of accessibility. Things like what The Last of Us Part 2 did, and where they're going to go with their game, how they perfected this game, and what they generally like to see from new games.
Jamie and Dave are not from the visually impaired and blind community, and they're taking a genuine interest in making games accessible.
And not just for blind people, just for all walks of disability.
I was going to say all walks of disability is a bit insensitive, because not everyone can walk.
Whatever, all roles of disability.
Well, we hope you enjoyed this episode. We're going to have a second episode coming up next week.
See you then.
Adios.
Thanks for listening to the Seesaw Podcast.
You can find us on Facebook at Seesaw Podcast, Twitter, Seesaw Pod. You can email us at seesawpodcast@gmail.com. You can also find us on TikTok and Instagram at Seesaw Podcast or Seesaw Pod, depending on which one we want. But get us on the other places. This podcast was recorded in front of a blind audience.